There's something profoundly disturbing about stepping into Yharnam for the first time. The cobblestone streets, slick with blood, the distant screams echoing through narrow alleyways, the grotesque creatures that were once human shambling through the darkness. But the truly unhinged part isn't what you can see. No, the madness of Bloodborne runs so much deeper than the visceral horror painted across its Gothic architecture. The real insanity lies in what happened before you ever arrived, in the desperate choices made by scholars and clergymen, in the cosmic entities that exist beyond human comprehension, and in the cycle of violence that has repeated itself across civilizations for thousands of years. Bloodborne isn't just a game about hunting beasts in a Victorian nightmare. It's a story about humanity's hubris, about the price of forbidden knowledge, about gods that lose their children and seek surrogates in the most disturbing ways possible. It's about blood that promises healing but delivers transformation, about dreams that trap you in service to incomprehensible beings, and about the thin line between enlightenment and madness. And when you start pulling at the threads of this world, when you begin to understand what really happened in Yharnam, in the fishing hamlet, in the ancient labyrinths beneath the city, you realize just how utterly unhinged the entire situation truly is. The city of Yharnam itself stands as a monument to mankind's foolish ambitions. Built atop the ruins of an ancient civilization, Yharnam rose to prominence through the miracle of blood healing, a medical practice that could cure any ailment, restore vigor to the aged, and grant strength beyond human limits. Pilgrims traveled from distant lands to partake in this miraculous blood ministration, and the city flourished under the guidance of the Healing Church, the religious organization that controlled access to this sacred blood. But like all things in Bloodborne, this miracle was built on a foundation of secrets, lies, and horrors that most citizens would never comprehend. The game draws heavily from the cosmic horror works of H.P. Lovecraft, that master of existential dread who understood that the most terrifying thing in the universe isn't a monster you can fight, but the realization that humanity is insignificant in the face of incomprehensible cosmic forces. Bloodborne takes that Lovecraftian philosophy and runs with it, creating a world where seeking knowledge and understanding doesn't lead to enlightenment, but to transformation, madness, and the realization that you were never truly in control. The more you learn about Yharnam, the more you understand just how doomed everyone has been from the very beginning. What makes Bloodborne's lore particularly fascinating is how it hides its deepest secrets in item descriptions, environmental storytelling, and the optional chalice dungeons that most players might never fully explore. The game doesn't hand you its story on a platter. Instead, it scatters pieces of the puzzle throughout its nightmare world, forcing you to piece together the truth from fragments of information, from the ravings of mad scholars, from the architecture of ancient tombs, and from the items you collect from corpses scattered throughout the city. And when you finally start to see the full picture, when you understand what the Healing Church did, what happened to Queen Yharnam, what curse befell the hunters, the sheer audacity and horror of it all becomes almost overwhelming. This is a world where a church conducted experiments on innocent people, trying to force them to ascend to a higher plane of existence, where hunters massacred an entire fishing village because its inhabitants had connection to a great one, where scholars cracked open skulls looking for eyes on the inside of brains, where a queen was impregnated by a formless god and had her child stolen, where the first hunter is trapped in an eternal dream, forced to guide others in an endless cycle of violence, where even the protagonist, the good hunter, is ultimately just another pawn in games played by cosmic entities that view humans as little more than potential vessels for their lost children. The truly unhinged part is how everything connects, how the ancient Pthumerians fell to the same beast scourge that now plagues Yharnam, how the discovery of their labyrinths led directly to the founding of the Healing Church, how the church's experiments and atrocities created the hunter's nightmare that traps blood-drunk hunters for eternity, how even the moon hanging in the sky appears connected to cosmic forces, with the blood moon seeming to respond to Great One activity and the moon presence itself descending from that pale orb when it claims new hosts. Every thread you pull reveals another layer of horror, another piece of the cosmic machinery grinding humanity beneath its wheels. So let's descend into this madness together. Let's explore the ruins of the Pthumerian civilization and understand how their communion with Great Ones sealed their fate. Let's walk through the halls of Byrgenwerth and witness the moment when scholarly curiosity crossed into dangerous obsession. Let's expose the healing church's lies and examine the atrocities committed in the name of ascension. Let's meet the Great Ones themselves and understand their alien desires. Let's uncover what really happened in the fishing hamlet and why it cursed an entire lineage of hunters. And let's ultimately understand why you, the player, might be the most tragic figure in this entire unhinged narrative. The ancient foundations, the Pthumerians. Long before Yharnam rose to prominence, long before the healing church ever existed, there was Pthumeru. This ancient superhuman civilization carved vast labyrinths deep beneath the earth, creating a network of catacombs and tombs that would remain buried and forgotten for countless centuries. The Pthumerians were described as superhuman beings, possessing abilities and knowledge far beyond normal humans, and they served as guardians and caretakers of something far more significant than mere treasure. They were the keepers of the Great Ones, those cosmic entities that exist on a higher plane of reality, beings that might be called gods by some and eldritch abominations by others. The Pthumerian civilization wasn't just technologically or magically advanced. They had achieved something that scholars in Yharnam would spend generations trying to replicate. They had made direct contact with the Great Ones and established a symbiotic relationship with these cosmic entities. Through this communion, the Pthumerians gained access to the Old Blood, a substance of divine origin that possessed miraculous properties. This blood could heal wounds, cure diseases, extend life, and grant supernatural abilities. The Pthumerians used this gift to build their society, to strengthen their warriors, and to elevate their civilization to heights that would not be matched for millennia. But here's where things start to get unhinged. The Pthumerians weren't just peaceful caretakers of sleeping gods. They developed complex blood rituals. They carved their labyrinths ever deeper into the earth, and they structured their entire society around the worship and service of these Great Ones. Early Pthumerians were described as mere humble guardians, but as their civilization evolved, they felt entitled to name themselves leaders, establishing a monarchy with a queen as their figurehead. This shift from humble guardianship to entitled rulership would prove significant, as it represented humanity's eternal flaw. Even when granted access to cosmic knowledge and power, we inevitably let pride and ambition corrupt us. Queen Yharnam, the last queen of Pthumeru, stands as one of the most tragic figures in Bloodborne's entire narrative. She wasn't just a political leader, but someone whose blood was considered particularly potent, so powerful that other Pthumerians considered it an honor to receive it. But Queen Yharnam's story takes a dark turn when she becomes involved with Eden, one of the most powerful and enigmatic Great Ones. Eden is unique among the Great Ones because he has no physical form whatsoever. He exists only as voice and influence, having transcended the need for a body entirely. And Eden, like all Great Ones, yearned for a child. The circumstances of Queen Yharnam's impregnation by Eden remain unclear, but what we know is disturbing. Through corrupted blood, through a liaison that may or may not have been willing, Queen Yharnam became pregnant with Murgo, an infant Great One. In the Chalice dungeons, when you finally encounter Queen Yharnam as a boss fight, she appears chained and bound, her eyes covered, still pregnant with Murgo even though she's essentially a ghost. Her dress is white at the start of the battle, but becomes progressively bloodier as the fight continues. And throughout it all, you can hear the infant Murgo crying. It's one of the most viscerally disturbing boss encounters in the entire game, made worse by the knowledge that this queen wasn't a villain, but a victim. But Murgo's birth, or perhaps more accurately, Murgo's stillbirth, represents a crucial piece of Bloodborne's lore. The game repeatedly tells us through various umbilical cord descriptions that every Great One loses its child and then yearns for a surrogate. This statement becomes the key to understanding so much of what happens in Bloodborne. The Great Ones, for all their cosmic power and incomprehensible nature, share one thing with humanity: the desire for children and the tragedy of loss. But because they cannot successfully have children of their own, they seek surrogates among humanity. And this desire, this yearning, drives much of the horror that unfolds throughout the game. Murgo's fate becomes even more complex. The child was taken from Queen Yharnam, and in the Nightmare of Mensis, you find Murgo being protected by Murgo's wet nurse, a towering great one with 6 arms and dark wings. Whether Murgo is truly dead, stillborn, or existing in some incomprehensible state between life and death remains ambiguous. What's clear is that Murgo exists in the Nightmare realm and that the School of Mensis, a faction of the Healing Church, managed to make contact with this infant Great One. This contact granted them audience with Murgo and presumably access to eldritch knowledge, but it came at a terrible price. The description of an umbilical cord tells us that this communion resulted in the stillbirth of their brains. The scholars of Mensis literally had their brains destroyed by exposure to truths their human minds couldn't comprehend. The fall of Pthumeru mirrors what would eventually happen to Yharnam in chilling detail. Just as Yharnam would succumb to the beast scourge through overuse of the old blood, ancient Pthumeru fell to the same fate. Evidence throughout the Chalice dungeons shows Pthumerians transformed into bestial creatures, their humanity stripped away by the very blood that once elevated their civilization. Another ancient land called Lauren met the same fate, its civilization collapsing into ruins as its inhabitants transformed into savage beasts. The cycle has repeated across multiple civilizations, and nobody in Yharnam seems to have learned from this pattern. The Chalice dungeons themselves serve as tombs, but what they're tombing remains ambiguous. Are they meant to contain the Great Ones, preventing these cosmic entities from escaping to the surface? Or are they meant to keep others from discovering the secrets and power hidden below? The Healing Church's various factions dedicated themselves to exploring these dungeons, sending tomb prospectors into the depths to uncover knowledge and blood that should perhaps have remained buried. These expeditions would ultimately provide the foundation for everything the Healing Church would become, for good and for catastrophically ill. Walking through these ancient ruins, you can feel the weight of history, the sense that you're treading through the graveyard of a civilization that thought itself enlightened and advanced. The Pthumerian architecture speaks of a culture that had achieved great things, but the enemies you encounter, the transformed and corrupted descendants of that once great civilization, tell the real story. They thought communion with cosmic entities would elevate them, but instead it consumed them. They sought transcendence, but found only transformation into monsters. And the truly unhinged part is that the scholars of Byrgenwerth and the clergy of the Healing Church looked at this evidence of failure and thought, yes, but we'll do it better. The connection between ancient Pthumeru and modern Yharnam runs deeper than simple historical parallel. The city of Yharnam was literally built on top of Pthumerian ruins, constructed above these ancient labyrinths like a new civilization trying to plant itself on poisoned soil. The nobles of Cainhurst Castle show remarkable parallels to the Pthumerians, from their pale appearance and matriarchal society to the presence of Pthumerian items and enemies in locations tied to Cainhurst. Bloodlickers appear only in Cainhurst and the Chalice dungeons. Cainhurst knights can be found deep in the labyrinths, and the bell-ringing woman enemy is even described as a mad Pthumerian, despite her Cainhurst garb. Whether Cainhurst's nobility are literal descendants of Pthumerians who reached the surface, or simply adopted Pthumerian practices and culture, remains a matter of interpretation. Either way, Cainhurst's connection to that ancient civilization is undeniable, and the Vilebloods would play their own complicated role in Yharnam's story. Queen Yharnam herself appears multiple times throughout the game, always in places of significance. After you defeat Rom the vacuous spider and lift the veil that has been hiding the true nature of reality, you encounter Queen Yharnam kneeling outside the Grand Cathedral, weeping blood and pointing toward the Nightmare of Mensis where Murgo waits. She appears again outside the boss arena where you fight Murgo's wet nurse, and her presence there, bowing to you after you've defeated the wet nurse, suggests a release, a freeing of both herself and her child from whatever torment they've endured. The city of Yharnam, named after this ancient queen, carries the weight of her tragedy in its very name. The Yharnam Stone, an item you receive after defeating Queen Yharnam in the Chalice dungeon, resembles a lithopedion, a calcified fetus. It serves no mechanical purpose in the game, existing purely as a lore item, a physical manifestation of the tragedy that befell this queen and her child. It's a reminder that beneath all the cosmic horror, beneath the eldritch entities and incomprehensible truths, there are deeply human tragedies. A mother separated from her child, an infant that may or may not have ever truly been born, and the echoes of that loss reverberating through time to curse an entirely different civilization. Byrgenwerth and the Discovery. The story of modern Yharnam, of the blood healing that would define the city and the horror that would consume it, begins not with the healing church but with an institution of learning. Byrgenwerth was a university, a place of scholarship and research founded by a man known as Master Willem. Situated on the shores of a great lake in a remote, secluded location, Byrgenwerth attracted students from across the land who shared Willem's passion for understanding the deeper truths of existence. This wasn't a place of religious doctrine or blind faith, but of scientific inquiry, astronomical observation, and archaeological exploration. At least, that's what it started as. Master Willem had a particular philosophy about human evolution and transcendence. Unlike others who would come later, Willem believed that the key to elevating humanity lay not in blood but in eyes, in insight, in the accumulation of knowledge and understanding. His famous phrase, "We are thinking on the basest of planes. What we need are more eyes," encapsulates his belief that humanity must evolve its consciousness and perception to ascend to a higher state of being. He encouraged his students to seek eyes on the inside of their brains, to line their minds with eyes through the accumulation of insight that would let them perceive truths invisible to ordinary humans. Willem even had his students wear blindfolds, encouraging them to look inward rather than outward, to develop their inner sight. The turning point for Byrgenwerth came with the discovery of the ancient Pthumerian labyrinths beneath Yharnam. Willem's scholars, acting as tomb prospectors and archaeologists, uncovered these ruins and immediately recognized their significance. Here was physical proof that an advanced civilization had once existed, one that had achieved levels of knowledge and power beyond what modern society possessed. But more importantly, they discovered evidence of the Great Ones, of the cosmic entities that the Pthumerians had communed with. And in these ancient tombs, they found the old blood. The discovery of the old blood, this holy medium that could be found in ornate coffins throughout the labyrinths, sparked an obsession within Byrgenwerth. This wasn't ordinary blood. It possessed properties that defied understanding. It didn't coagulate. It seemed to carry within it echoes of cosmic power, and experimentation revealed that it could heal, strengthen, and transform those who consumed it. Here was physical evidence that the Pthumerians' legends were true, that communion with higher beings was possible, and that this blood was the medium through which such communion could be achieved. But this discovery created a schism within Byrgenwerth, a fundamental disagreement between Master Willem and his most prominent student, Lawrence. Where Willem saw danger and urged caution, Lawrence saw opportunity and potential. Willem understood, perhaps through study of the Pthumerian ruins or through his own insight, that the old blood was dangerous. His famous adage, "Fear the old blood," represented his position that while the blood might offer power and knowledge, the price of using it was too high. He had seen what happened to the Pthumerians. He understood that the path of blood led to the beast scourge, to the loss of humanity, to transformation into monsters. Evolution, through eyes, through insight, through understanding, was the only safe path forward. Lawrence disagreed fundamentally. From his perspective, Willem was being overcautious, allowing fear to obstruct progress. The old blood represented an opportunity to actually achieve what Byrgenwerth had been founded to accomplish, the elevation of humanity to a higher plane of existence. They had proof that it was possible, because the Pthumerians had done it. Yes, that civilization had fallen, but perhaps they had simply made mistakes that could be avoided. Perhaps with proper study and careful application, the power of the old blood could be harnessed without the disastrous consequences. In Lawrence's view, Willem's insistence on pursuing only the path of eyes was limiting Byrgenwerth's potential and denying humanity access to genuine transcendence. This philosophical divide wasn't unique to just Willem and Lawrence. The scholars of Byrgenwerth essentially split into two factions. The Loyalists, led by Willem, continued to pursue evolution through eyes and insight. This group included the runesmith Carol, who could transcribe the incomprehensible utterings of great ones into visual symbols, and Rom, a scholar who would eventually undergo a transformation of her own. The radicals, led by Lawrence, believed in evolution through blood and left Byrgenwerth to found their own organization. This group included Lawrence himself, Mikolash, who would eventually found the School of Mensis, and Gehrman, the first hunter. The moment of the split is immortalized in a memory that players can experience by touching a skull in the Grand Cathedral. You hear a younger Lawrence speaking to Willem. Master Willem, I'm going to tell the Church Fathers of this discovery. The old blood will be our guide. And Willem's response, we are born of the blood, made men by the blood, undone by the blood. Fear the old blood. Then Lawrence makes a promise. I will never forget our adage. But of course, he did forget. Or perhaps more accurately, he chose to ignore it because his ambition overpowered his caution. Lawrence and his fellow radicals took the forbidden Great One blood they had discovered and left Byrgenwerth to establish a new organization in Yharnam proper, the Healing Church. If Willem wanted them to proceed cautiously with the blood, then they would. Rather than testing it on themselves without proper controls, they would outsource their test subjects. They would refine the old blood into a form suitable for distribution to the masses and offer it as a miracle cure, as a medical treatment that could heal any ailment. This would serve multiple purposes. It would allow them to observe the effects of the blood on a large population. It would generate gratitude and devotion from the people they were helping. And it would establish an organization that could fund and protect further research into the blood's properties and potential. The scholars who remained at Byrgenwerth continued their own research, though with fewer resources and reduced numbers. Willem's approach bore fruit in unexpected ways. Rom, one of the scholars, somehow underwent transformation into what players encounter as Rom the Vacuous Spider. Whether this transformation was Willem's doing, something Rom chose herself, or an unintended consequence of their research remains unclear. In her new form, Rom gained the ability to maintain an illusion that hid the true horror of Yharnam's situation from its inhabitants. This power proved crucial to maintaining the fragile stability of Yharnam, keeping the full truth hidden from those who weren't ready to perceive it. Byrgenwerth itself became forbidden ground as the Healing Church rose to prominence and eventually claimed dominance over Yharnam. Dense forests grew around Willem's school, hiding it from casual discovery, and few ventured there. Willem himself remained at Byrgenwerth, continuing his research in isolation. And when you finally meet him in the game, you find an ancient man sitting in a chair overlooking the lake, barely able to speak, his head covered in strange growths that might be parasites or might be something else entirely. He's so old that he shouldn't still be alive by any natural means, suggesting that Willem's pursuit of knowledge through eyes came with its own costs and transformations. The schism between Byrgenwerth and the Healing Church wasn't just philosophical but deeply personal. Willem felt betrayed by Lawrence's departure and his willingness to use the old blood despite understanding its dangers. Lawrence likely felt frustrated by Willem's refusal to embrace what seemed like the most direct path to achieving their goals. And in a way, both were right. Willem was correct that the old blood was dangerous and would lead to catastrophe. But Lawrence was also correct that it represented the most practical means of achieving tangible results. The tragedy is that both approaches led to horror in their own ways. Rom's transformation into the vacuous spider isn't exactly a triumphant example of successful evolution through eyes, and the beast scourge that would consume Yharnam proved Willem's warnings about the old blood correct. The true madness of Byrgenwerth's legacy lies in how both paths, pursued to their logical conclusions, led to the same destination: contact with cosmic entities that humans weren't meant to comprehend, transformation into forms that barely resembled humanity, and the loss of everything that made someone human to begin with. Whether you sought ascension through accumulated insight or through the consumption of divine blood, the price was your humanity, and neither Willem nor Lawrence seemed to fully grasp this until it was far too late. The Healing Church's rise and corruption. The Healing Church rose to power through a simple yet effective strategy. It offered something that everyone needed and nobody else could provide: blood ministration. The practice of using refined old blood to heal diseases and injuries represented a genuine miracle. In an era before modern medicine, in a world where a simple infection could mean death and chronic illnesses were lifelong sentences, the Church's ability to cure any ailment seemed nothing short of divine intervention. People flocked to Yharnam from distant lands specifically to receive blood healing, and the city flourished as it became known as the place where the impossible was possible. Lawrence, now the first vicar of the Healing Church, proved to be not just a talented scholar, but a skilled leader and organizer. He structured the church hierarchically, creating multiple specialized divisions that could pursue different aspects of research and maintain different functions within the organization. To the general populace, the Healing Church appeared to be exactly what it claimed, a benevolent religious institution dedicated to healing the sick and improving humanity's lot. But beneath this facade, the church was something very different. It was fundamentally a research organization conducting experiments that would make modern ethical review boards weep, all in pursuit of that same goal that Byrgenwerth had once chased, forcing humanity to ascend to a higher plane of existence. The choir represented the upper echelon of the Healing Church, the elite scholars who occupied the upper cathedral ward and pursued the most advanced research. While Lawrence had split from Byrgenwerth over the issue of blood versus eyes, the choir ironically reverted back toward Willem's philosophy. They recognized that insight and eyes were indeed crucial to ascension, but they weren't willing to give up the power that came from the old blood, so they pursued both paths simultaneously. The choir made a discovery that would define their research. They found Ebrides, the daughter of the cosmos, a great one that they discovered in the ancient ruins beneath Yharnam. Rather than worshipping Ebrides from a respectful distance, the choir imprisoned this great one beneath the grand cathedral and began extracting her blood for their experiments. Ebrides represents one of the more sympathetic great ones in Bloodborne's narrative. When you encounter her in the Altar of Despair, she's mourning over what appears to be a representation of Ram. These two seem to share some connection, possibly as fellow great ones who were once human scholars who transformed, possibly as entities who both served as sources of knowledge for the Healing Church. Ebrides seems almost willing to help the choir, providing them with communion and insight. But the choir's relationship with her was fundamentally exploitative. They didn't view her as an equal or even as a being deserving of respect. She was a resource to be mined, a subject to be studied, and a means to an end. The choir's experiments weren't limited to studying Ebrides. They attempted to create what they called kin, humans who could ascend partway to becoming great ones through exposure to cosmic knowledge and transformation. The celestial emissary, one of the bosses you fight, represents one of their experimental subjects. These kin retain enough human-like features to be disturbing in their uncanniness, but they're clearly no longer human in any meaningful sense. The choir dressed their kin experiments in special garb and continued testing on them, treating thinking, feeling beings as nothing more than lab rats in pursuit of forbidden knowledge. Another major faction within the Healing Church was the School of Mensis, led by Mikolash, host of the Nightmare. Where the choir maintained at least some pretense of dignity and structure, the School of Mensis dove completely into madness. They established themselves in Yahargul, the unseen village, and conducted rituals aimed at beckoning the blood moon and making direct contact with great ones. Using umbilical cords and forbidden knowledge, the School of Mensis managed to contact Murgo, that infant great one who was once Queen Yharnam's child. This communion granted them access to eldritch truths, but at the cost of their sanity and eventually their lives. The School of Mensis's grand ritual had catastrophic consequences. They successfully beckoned the blood moon, which blurred the line between the nightmare realm and reality, and they created the Nightmare of Mensis, a horrible dimension where they became trapped. The ritual accelerated the beast scourge throughout Yharnam, causing mass transformations and chaos. Mikolash and his colleagues had their brains effectively destroyed by exposure to knowledge their human minds couldn't process, yet they persist in the nightmare, with Mikolash himself becoming the host of the nightmare, endlessly running through a maze of his own making, giggling madly about eyes on the inside and his communion with the Great Kos or Cosm. The Hunters represented another crucial arm of the Healing Church, though their relationship with the Church was complicated. The first hunter, Gehrman, established the practice of hunting beasts to protect Yharnam's citizens from those who had transformed due to the beast scourge. Initially, hunting was conducted quietly, almost secretly, as the church didn't want to advertise that their miracle blood had such dangerous side effects. But as the scourge worsened, the need for hunters became undeniable. Ludwig, a church cleric known as the Holy Blade, eventually established a new workshop and transformed hunting into an official church function. Ludwig himself represents the tragic arc of many who served the church faithfully. He was devoted to his duty, wielded the legendary Holy Moonlight Sword, and established principles of honorable hunting that his followers sought to emulate. But Ludwig eventually succumbed to the beast scourge himself, transforming into a hideous abomination known as Ludwig the Accursed. In the Old Hunters DLC, you find him in the Hunter's Nightmare, now a horrible, horse-like beast who has forgotten everything about who he once was. If you manage to restore his memory by showing him his beloved sword, he briefly regains his sanity, only to realize what he's become and express horror at his transformation. The church's most devoted servant ultimately suffered the same fate as those he had sworn to protect Yharnam against. The executioners represented yet another church faction, zealots dedicated to wiping out the vile bloods of Cainhurst Castle. The church spread rumors that the vile bloods had been given forbidden blood and had become fiendish creatures, though in reality, the vile blood's crime was simply possessing a strain of old blood that the church didn't control. The massacre at Cainhurst was thorough and brutal, with executioners slaughtering nearly every vile blood they could find. Martyr Logarius, their leader, stationed himself at the entrance to Cainhurst's castle, guarding it even after death to prevent anyone from accessing the secrets within, specifically the fact that Queen Annalise was immortal and couldn't truly be killed. The story of ashen blood disease remains one of the church's darkest chapters, though the full truth may never be known. This mysterious illness ravaged Old Yharnam, described as a baffling sickness that appeared seemingly out of nowhere and devastated the population. The church conveniently arrived with the old blood to cure the disease, earning the profound gratitude and trust of Old Yharnam's citizens. Some believe the healing church itself was responsible for the ashen blood outbreak, possibly contaminating the water supply to create a crisis they could then solve with blood ministration. The timing certainly seems suspicious, and such an act would have achieved multiple goals: eliminating resistance to blood healing, demonstrating the power of their cure, and creating a population dependent on church blood. However, it's equally possible that ashen blood emerged naturally or from contaminated blood sources, with the church simply capitalizing on an existing crisis. The game's item descriptions suggest the church viewed medicine not as treatment but as research, exposing themselves to infection to gain knowledge, which hints at their willingness to experiment dangerously even if it doesn't confirm deliberate plague spreading. The irony of Old Yharnam's fate is particularly cruel. The district that had been saved by blood healing eventually fell hardest to the beast scourge, with mass transformations turning the entire area into a nightmare of beasts. The response was swift and merciless. The church had the entire district burned, with hunters led by Jura slaughtering or incinerating every living thing in Old Yharnam. The district was sealed off and forbidden, becoming a tomb for thousands who had trusted the church to save them. Jura himself would eventually reject the hunt entirely, recognizing the humanity that still existed in some of the beasts and refusing to participate in further massacres. The Healing Church's research facilities tell stories of atrocities committed in the name of progress. The Research Hall, accessible through the Old Hunters DLC, shows where the church conducted experiments on patients, forcibly enlarging their heads in an attempt to give them eyes on the inside. These experiments were supervised by Lady Maria of the Astral Clock Tower, herself a former hunter and student of Gehrman, who had become the caretaker of these poor subjects. The patients pray to Maria for salvation even as she oversees their torture, and when you finally confront her, she defends the secrets of the research hall with deadly determination, though you can sense the guilt and revulsion she feels for her role in these experiments. Throughout all of this, the common citizens of Yharnam remained largely ignorant of what the church truly was doing. They saw the miracles of blood healing, They witnessed hunters protecting them from beasts, and they attended services at the Grand Cathedral. They didn't know about Ebritus imprisoned beneath the church, about the failed experiments creating kin in the upper cathedral ward, about the School of Mencus's rituals that were accelerating the scourge, or about the original sins committed at the fishing hamlet. The church maintained its facade of benevolence while conducting research that would make the most unethical modern pharmaceutical companies seem tame by comparison. The ultimate irony of the Healing Church is that Lawrence himself, the founder and first vicar who had been so certain that he could use the old blood responsibly, eventually succumbed to the beast scourge in a particularly horrific manner. His beast form, encountered in the Old Hunters DLC, is massive and on fire, vomiting lava and blood as he attacks. The skull you touch to receive the flashback of his conversation with Willem is Lawrence's own beast skull, kept in the Grand Cathedral as a relic. The man who broke his promise to fear the old blood became one of its most monstrous victims. The Great Ones, incomprehensible cosmic horror. At the center of Bloodborne's lore stand the Great Ones, entities that exist on a higher plane of reality than humans can naturally perceive. These beings are what give Bloodborne its distinctly Lovecraftian flavor, representing cosmic forces that are neither fully malevolent nor benevolent, but simply incomprehensible to human understanding. They don't operate according to human morality or logic. Their motivations, their desires, and their very nature exist beyond human comprehension. And yet, for all their cosmic power and alien nature, they share one peculiar and tragic similarity with humanity. They lose their children and yearn for surrogates. The Great Ones aren't a unified group with a common agenda. Each seems to have its own nature, its own relationship with humanity, and its own role in the cosmic order. Some interact directly with the physical world, while others exist primarily in dream or nightmare dimensions. Some seem sympathetic to humanity's plight, while others appear indifferent or actively hostile. What connects them is their fundamental alienness, their existence on a plane of reality that humans weren't meant to perceive, and the profound consequences that arise whenever humans and Great Ones interact. Odin stands out among the Great Ones as perhaps the most powerful and certainly the most enigmatic. Unlike the others who possess physical forms, Odin has transcended physicality entirely, existing only as voice and influence. He's formless, omnipresent in a sense, and capable of accomplishing things that other Great Ones cannot. One of the Carol runes describes Odin's essence as blood itself, suggesting that his influence permeates the very substance that defines so much of Bloodborne's horror. There's even a chapel dedicated to Odin in Cathedral Ward, indicating that he's worshipped or at least acknowledged by some citizens of Yharnam, though few likely understand who or what they're actually worshipping. Eden's most significant action in Bloodborne's narrative is his apparent impregnation of multiple women. Queen Yharnam, as discussed, bore Murgo after her liaison with Eden, but Eden doesn't stop there. During the game, if you've been accepting blood vials from Ariana the prostitute, she eventually becomes pregnant. The umbilical cord you can retrieve after the birth describes how every Great One loses its child and then yearns for a surrogate, and Eden, the formless Great One, is no different. To think, it was corrupted blood that began this eldritch liaison. Eden impregnates Ariana through the blood she exchanges with others, using her position and her distant relation to Cainhurst nobility as vectors for creating another potential surrogate child. Similarly, if you send people to Iosefka's clinic, the imposter Iosefka, who has taken over the facility, conducts experiments on them, and she herself becomes pregnant after you defeat Rom and the blood moon descends. Again, this pregnancy produces an umbilical cord and appears to be Eden's doing. The formless Great One is actively attempting to create children through these human women, seeking surrogates for the children that Great Ones cannot successfully bear themselves. The mechanics of how a formless entity accomplishes this, the question of whether these women have any choice in the matter, and the ultimate fate of these surrogate children all contribute to the profoundly disturbing nature of Eden's role in the story. Murgo, that infant Great One who is the child of Eden and Queen Yharnam, exists in a peculiar state. Various item descriptions refer to stillbirth, but whether Murgo is truly dead, existing in some liminal state between life and death, or simply incomprehensible to human perception, remains one of the game's great mysteries. What's clear is that Murgo exists within the nightmare of Mensis, creating and sustaining that dimension through their presence. The infant requires protection in the form of Murgo's wet nurse, a towering great one with 6 skeletal arms and dark wings who serves as guardian and caretaker. When you finally fight Murgo's wet nurse at the apex of the nightmare of Mensis, the battle itself is mechanically straightforward, but the implications are devastating. Throughout the fight, you hear Murgo crying, the sounds of an infant in distress echoing across the nightmare realm. After you defeat the wet nurse, those cries suddenly stop, replaced by what sounds like laughter or perhaps relief. A message appears on screen saying, "Nightmare slain." One of only 3 times this specific message appears in the game. Whether you freed Murgo from torment, killed them, or accomplished something else entirely remains open to interpretation. But the silence of those infant cries carries an emotional weight that few boss victories in gaming possess. The Moon Presence represents perhaps the most directly impactful Great One in Bloodborne's narrative, as it's the entity responsible for the hunter's dream itself. Also called Flora, according to dialogue from the doll, the Moon Presence appears as a grotesque being with a spine-like body, tentacles resembling hair, and a face that's simply a gaping hole. Despite its horrific appearance, the Moon Presence serves as both the creator and maintainer of the hunter's dream, the supernatural space where hunters respawn after death and where Gehrman guides them in their hunt. The Moon Presence's motivations remain mysterious, though evidence hints at its purpose. A note found in the lecture building states, "Hunt the Great Ones," suggesting the entire purpose of the hunters and the dream might be to eliminate competing Great Ones. This would explain why the Moon Presence created the hunter's dream and bound Gehrman to it, using him as a surrogate to guide hunter after hunter through their bloody work. When you defeat Gehrman and refuse his offer to release you from the dream, the Moon Presence descends from the Blood Moon itself to claim you as the new host of the dream. If you've consumed 3 umbilical cords, however, you resist the Moon Presence's attempt to enslave you, forcing it to fight you directly. Defeating the Moon Presence leads to perhaps the strangest ending in the game. Your hunter transforms into an infant Great One, a small, slug-like creature that the doll gently picks up and cradles. You've effectively ascended beyond humanity, achieved what so many scholars and clergy members were trying to accomplish. Whether you've become a surrogate child for the Moon Presence, become the next Moon Presence yourself, or transformed into something entirely new remains open to interpretation. What's certain is that you've evolved beyond human limitations, existing now as a cosmic entity. Whether this represents victory, tragedy, or both depends entirely on your perspective and what value you place on maintaining one's humanity. Amygdala represents another class of Great Ones, massive beings that cling to buildings throughout Yharnam, invisible unless you have sufficient insight to perceive them. These spider-like entities with grotesque arms and horrible faces exist both in the physical world and in the Nightmare Frontier. The amygdala in the Nightmare Frontier serves as a boss fight, teleporting around and tearing off its own arms to use as weapons. But the amygdalae hanging on buildings throughout Yharnam seem largely passive unless provoked, simply watching events unfold with their many eyes. Their presence suggests that Great Ones have been observing Yharnam for quite some time, perhaps drawn by the mass use of old blood, or by the cosmic significance of the events unfolding there. Ram, the vacuous spider, occupies an unusual position because she appears to have once been human, specifically a scholar of Byrgenwerth who underwent transformation to become a Great One, or at least something very close to one. Her physical form resembles a grotesque spider covered in bulbous growths, and she's protected by smaller spider-like entities. Ram has been granted, or has achieved the power to maintain an illusion that hides the true nature of Yharnam from its inhabitants, concealing the amygdalae clinging to buildings, suppressing the visibility of the blood moon, and generally keeping reality stable. When you kill Ram, the veil is lifted, and suddenly you can see all the horror that's been present all along. The brain of Mensis represents another form of Great One, this one retrieved by the School of Mensis from the Nightmare Realm. It's literally a giant brain lined with eyes, just as the scholars of Byrgenwerth had theorized. But this brain is rotten and evil, according to its description, capable of causing frenzy in anyone who looks at it. The brain hangs from the nightmare sky like a cursed moon, and if you're clever, you can navigate through the nightmare of Mensis to knock it down into a pit, where it remains alive but helpless. The brain's existence proves that the eyes on the inside philosophy wasn't entirely wrong, but it also demonstrates that achieving such transcendence doesn't guarantee wisdom, benevolence, or anything positive. Ebritas, the daughter of the cosmos, presents as possibly the most sympathetic of the Great Ones. Left behind by other Great Ones according to her lore, discovered by the choir, and kept in the altar of despair, Ebritas seems less actively malevolent than most. When you encounter her in the boss arena, she's positioned near what appears to be a representation or corpse of Ram, and she seems to be mourning. This has led many to theorize about a connection between these two beings, perhaps as fellow Great Ones who were once human scholars, or as entities who both aided the healing church in different ways. Ebritas provided communion and knowledge to the choir willingly, and when you fight her, her attacks seem almost defensive rather than aggressive. The name Daughter of the Cosmos suggests she might have a parental relationship to other Great Ones, raising questions about Great One families that the game never fully answers. What makes the Great Ones particularly unhinged in the context of Bloodborne's lore is how their alien nature intersects with fundamentally human concepts like parenthood, loss, and the desire for children. These cosmic entities that exist beyond normal comprehension, that can create nightmares and drive humans mad with a glance, that can manipulate blood itself and alter reality, all of them share this one strange commonality with humanity. They want children but cannot have them successfully, so they seek surrogates among humans. This bizarre intersection of the cosmic and the intimate, the incomprehensible and the deeply relatable, creates a unique kind of horror that sets Bloodborne apart from typical cosmic horror narratives. The Hunter's Dream and the Tragedy of Gehrman. The Hunter's Dream serves as your base of operations throughout Bloodborne, a sanctuary where you can return after death, upgrade your weapons, level up, and prepare for your next venture into Yharnam's nightmare streets. The location itself is an otherworldly replica of the original Hunter's Workshop, a place that exists outside normal reality, suspended in a state between dream and waking. Messengers dwell in the workshop grounds, strange beings that serve as merchants and provide services. The doll, a life-size doll based on Lady Maria, roams the garden and can channel blood echoes to make you stronger. And presiding over it all is Gehrman, the first hunter, seated in a wheelchair beside his workshop, offering guidance and seemingly serving as your mentor. But the Hunter's Dream is not what it appears to be, and Gehrman's role is far more tragic than it initially seems. The dream is a prison, a trap created by the Moon Presence, and Gehrman is its unwilling caretaker, bound to guide hunter after hunter through their hunts for what might have been centuries. To understand how utterly devastating Gehrman's situation is, we need to go back to the beginning, to understand who he was and how he ended up in this eternal nightmare. Gehrman was the first hunter, the man who established the practice of hunting beasts to protect Yharnam's citizens. A scholar associated with Byrgenwerth, Gehrman worked alongside Master Willem and Lawrence, though his role was more practical than purely academic. When the beast scourge began manifesting, Gehrman took it upon himself to combat these creatures, developing weapons and techniques specifically designed for hunting. The burial blade, his signature weapon, was forged from siderite, a material that fell from the sky, hinting at cosmic connections even in his equipment. Gehrman established the original Hunter's Workshop beneath Eden Chapel, training others in the art of the hunt and developing the tools and methods that would define hunting for generations. Among Gehrman's students was Lady Maria of the Astral Clock Tower, a skilled hunter from Canehurst who joined his cause. Maria was formidable in combat, wielding the rakuyo, a trick weapon of exquisite craftsmanship, and she mastered blood arts that would later influence the fighting styles of others. But Lady Maria was more than just a skilled student to Gehrman. Evidence strongly suggests that Gehrman was in love with her, though whether Maria returned those feelings or even acknowledged them remains uncertain. Their relationship, whatever its exact nature, would have profound consequences for Gehrman's fate. The events at the fishing hamlet would change both Maria and Gehrman forever. As we'll explore in more detail later, Byrgenwerth scholars and their accompanying hunters committed atrocities at a small fishing village where the corpse of the Great One Kos had washed ashore. They massacred the villagers, cracked open skulls looking for eyes on the inside, and defiled Kos herself. Maria participated in this massacre, and the guilt of what she'd done weighed so heavily on her that she threw her beloved Rakuyo down a well and eventually took her own life. Some evidence suggests Gehrman was there too, possibly even playing a leading role, and that he too bore the guilt of those sins. At some point after Maria's death, Gehrman found himself alone, trapped in grief and loneliness. The original hunter's workshop, his legacy, was no longer in use, abandoned and largely forgotten. What happened next remains somewhat mysterious, but the results are clear. Gehrman became bound to the hunter's dream, an otherworldly space that exists outside normal reality. An umbilical cord found in the abandoned workshop suggests Gehrman used it to summon the moon presence, creating or facilitating the dream's existence. Whether this was a deliberate deal made in desperation, a ritual that went differently than intended, or something else entirely, we can only speculate. The result was that Gehrman became trapped in the dream, unable to wake, unable to die, serving as the guide for hunters who would be pulled into this supernatural space to aid in the hunt. One of the conditions or consequences of the dream's creation was the animation of a doll. Gehrman had created a physical doll modeled after Lady Maria, a substitute for the woman he'd loved and lost. When the hunter's dream came into being, this doll came to life, though what force animated her remains unclear. The moon presence may have done so as part of whatever arrangement created the dream, or perhaps another cosmic entity took pity on Gehrman's loneliness. Either way, the doll gained sapience and mobility, but she bore Maria's appearance without Maria's personality. Where Maria was strong-willed, determined, and intense, the doll is gentle, compliant, and motherly. This discrepancy seems to have made the doll's presence more painful than comforting for Gehrman. He kept a book in his workshop titled How to Pick Up Fair Maidens, a pathetic detail that speaks to his loneliness and his inability to move past his loss. The true horror of Gehrman's situation becomes apparent when you catch him sleeping. On certain occasions, you can find him dozing in his wheelchair, and if you approach close enough, you can hear what he mutters in his sleep. Master Willem, Lawrence, somebody help me. Unshackle me, please, anybody. Help me. I've made a grave mistake. These plaintive cries reveal the truth. Gehrman is a prisoner. The hunter's dream is a cage, and he's been trapped there, unable to wake, unable to die, forced to guide hunter after hunter through their quests for an incomprehensibly long time. The agreement he made with the moon presence has bound him in servitude, and he desperately wants to be freed. The doll herself presents another layer of tragedy. She seems to genuinely care for Gehrman and for the hunters who pass through the dream, offering comfort and support, speaking kindly even when mistreated. But she's also clearly not fully autonomous. The doll prays to Flora, of the moon, of the dream, suggesting her existence is tied to the moon presence that created or animated her. Her primary function is to make hunters stronger by channeling their blood echoes into levels, essentially serving as an interface for the dream's power systems. And despite her kindness and apparent sapience, Gehrman tells you at the start of the game that you can use the doll should it please you, a disturbing instruction that speaks to how he views this being based on his lost love. The few hunters who previously went through the hunter's dream and survived remember it only vaguely, like a fading dream upon waking. Jura, the retired hunter, says, "I no longer dream, but I was once a hunter too," acknowledging that he was once part of the dream, but remembering little of it. Eileen the Crow remembers more, and if you die fighting her, she'll say, "You still have dreams? Tell the little doll I said hello," confirming that she not only remembers the dream, but specifically remembers the doll who cared for her during her time there. These hunters passed through the dream, completed whatever service the moon presence required of them, and were released by Gehrman to wake in the real world with only fragmentary memories of their time in that supernatural space. When you defeat Murgo's wet nurse and silence Murgo's crying, the hunter's dream begins to burn. Gehrman sets the workshop on fire, though whether this is truly his doing or something that happens automatically as the dream begins to collapse remains ambiguous. With the immediate threat of Murgo's nightmare neutralized, your contract as a hunter is essentially complete. And Gehrman offers you a choice. He offers to release you from the dream, to let you wake in the real world with your memories fading like other hunters before you. You will die, forget the dream, and awake under the morning sun. You will be freed from this terrible hunter's dream. If you accept his offer and kneel before him, Gehrman rises from his wheelchair for the first and only time in the game, wielding the burial blade with a fluidity that belies his apparent frailty, and he executes you. But this execution isn't cruel. It's mercy. He's setting you free, allowing you to wake in Yharnam as the sun rises, released from the dream's hold. You've served your purpose, eliminated the immediate threat, and now you get to return to a normal life. This is the good ending in a sense, the one where you escape the cycle and go back to being a regular person, your dreams of blood and beasts fading into distant memory. But if you refuse his offer, if you stand up and reject his attempt to free you, Gehrman is forced to fight you properly. This battle is heartbreaking when you understand the context. Gehrman doesn't want to fight you. He's trying to free you, to save you from the fate he himself suffers. But you've refused his mercy, so he has no choice but to attempt to kill you to release you from the dream. The entire time you fight him, he's trying to help you, even as his burial blade transforms between forms, and he uses every technique he's mastered over his long existence to try to kill you. If you defeat Gehrman, the moon presence descends from the blood moon hanging in the sky, a grotesque cosmic entity coming to claim you. If you haven't consumed 3 umbilical cords, the moon presence embraces you, and you black out. When you wake, you're sitting in Gehrman's wheelchair, and the doll pushes you back toward the workshop, saying, "And so, the hunt begins again." You've taken Gehrman's place as the host of the dream, bound to guide future hunters just as he guided you. You've freed Gehrman from his torment, but only by taking on that torment yourself. The cycle continues, with you now serving as the moon presence's surrogate child and puppet. But if you've consumed 3 umbilical cords before this point, something different happens. These cords contain pieces of Great One essence, and consuming them grants you enough cosmic power and insight to resist the moon presence's attempt to bind you. When it descends to embrace you, you refuse, forcing it to fight you. This battle against the moon presence represents humanity's rejection of the Great One's manipulation, your refusal to be used as a pawn in cosmic games. And if you manage to defeat this supposedly all-powerful entity, you undergo a transformation, becoming an infant Great One yourself. The doll finds you, this strange, slug-like newborn, and gently picks you up, cradling you as she says, "Are you cold? Oh, good hunter." Gehrman's tragedy lies in how he tried to help others while being unable to help himself. He created tools and techniques that saved countless lives. He trained hunters who protected Yharnam's citizens. He guided hunter after hunter through the dream, offering advice and support. Even at the end, he tries to free you from the dream's prison, but he himself remains trapped, unable to wake, unable to die, bound to this service until someone either defeats him and takes his place or somehow breaks the cycle entirely. His connection to the fishing hamlet atrocity, his guilt over Maria's fate, his deal with the moon presence, they all combine to create a prison from which he cannot escape. The connection between Gehrman and the orphan of Kos deepens this tragedy. The orphan's crying sounds are the exact same audio file as Gehrman's sleeping cries, just pitched differently. After you defeat the orphan in the Old Hunters DLC, the doll comments that Gehrman is finally sleeping peacefully for the first time in a long while. The promotional material for the DLC showed a hunter dressed like Gehrman with a peg leg walking toward the lighthouse hut in the fishing hamlet. All of this suggests that Gehrman was deeply involved in the fishing hamlet massacre, possibly even the one who killed Kos or her orphan, and that the curse laid upon hunters originates in significant part from his actions. His guilt, his nightmares, his inability to find peace, all of it stems from sins committed before the hunter's dream ever existed. The Scourge of Beasts and the Blood Moon. At the heart of Yharnam's horror lies the Beast Scourge, a plague of transformation that turns humans into savage, monstrous creatures. This isn't a disease in any conventional sense, no pathogen or virus that could be studied under a microscope and potentially cured through medicine. The Scourge is fundamentally supernatural, tied to the old blood flowing through Yharnam's citizens, to the cosmic forces manipulating reality, and to humanity's own bestial nature brought to the surface. Understanding the scourge requires understanding the deep lore of blood itself, and how blood ties humanity to both the great ones above and the beasts within. The scourge didn't originate with Yharnam. As we've seen with the Pthumerians and the ancient land of Loren, civilizations that used old blood eventually fell to beast transformations. There's a cycle at play, a pattern that repeats across time whenever humans gain access to the blood of great ones and begin using it extensively. Initially, the blood seems miraculous, healing diseases, granting strength, extending life. But over time, something happens to those who've been exposed to it repeatedly. They begin to change, to lose their humanity, to become monstrous. The exact mechanism of the transformation remains somewhat mysterious, which fits the Lovecraftian themes perfectly. What's clear is that the old blood carries within it something that awakens or amplifies humanity's capacity for violence and savagery. There's a widespread belief in Yharnam that beast blood crept up the right leg, which is why many hunters and church officials wore distinctive pants, and why Gehrman himself has a right peg leg. Whether this belief has any basis in reality or is simply superstition born from fear doesn't truly matter. The important point is that transformation into a beast was a constant threat, something that could happen to anyone who'd been exposed to blood ministration. The transformations themselves follow a pattern. It typically begins with aggression, with a loss of rational thought and an increase in violent urges. People become blood drunk, a term used to describe hunters and others who've given in to the thrill of violence, who've started killing for the pleasure of it, rather than out of necessity. This blood drunkenness seems to be a precursor to full transformation. As the condition progresses, physical changes begin to manifest. People grow larger, hairier, their faces elongate into bestial snouts, their hands become clawed. Eventually, they lose all semblance of their former selves and become beasts entirely, creatures of pure instinct and hunger. The spectrum of beast transformations shows remarkable variety. Some people become relatively small, wolf-like beasts. Others transform into massive creatures with antlers or multiple limbs. Some maintain enough intelligence to use weapons or work in packs. The cleric beast, that towering monstrosity you fight on the Great Bridge at the start of the game, represents what happens when a church official undergoes transformation. Their devotion and power manifest in a particularly horrible form. Vicar Amelia, a high-ranking church official, transforms mid-ritual in the Grand Cathedral, becoming a white-furred beast of tremendous size. Even Ludwig the Holy Blade, perhaps the most decorated and faithful hunter in church history, eventually became a beast so massive and horrible that he's remembered as Ludwig the Accursed. The blood moon plays a crucial role in accelerating the scourge. When the blood moon rises, when that pale red moon appears in the sky, the line between man and beast blurs. Transformations happen more rapidly and more frequently. Those who'd been fighting to maintain their humanity suddenly lose that battle. The entire city descends further into chaos as more and more people undergo transformation. The blood moon isn't just a passive phenomenon, but seems to have agency, tied to the moon presence and possibly other great ones, actively working to blur the boundaries between different states of existence. The hunt itself represents Yharnam's response to the scourge, but it's a response that perpetuates the very problem it's trying to solve. Hunters go out into the streets each night, seeking beasts to kill, trying to cull the transformed before they can spread further chaos. But the hunt itself contributes to the cycle of violence and blood drunkenness. Hunters who kill too many beasts, who revel too much in the hunt, who give in to the thrill of violence, they themselves risk becoming beasts. The hunters of hunters, like Eileen the Crow, exist specifically to put down hunters who've gone too far, who've become blood-drunk and dangerous. It's a system that eats itself, where those meant to protect humanity from beasts become beasts themselves. Old Yharnam stands as the most tragic monument to the scourge's devastation. This district, which had once been saved from ashen blood disease through the miracle of blood healing, fell completely to the beast scourge. The transformation was so widespread, affecting so many people simultaneously, that the decision was made to simply burn the entire district. Hunters swept through, killing anything that moved, while flames consumed buildings and streets. The district was sealed off, declared forbidden, left as a charred graveyard filled with the tortured remains of those who'd trusted the church to save them. Jura, one of the few named hunters you can encounter, stations himself in Old Yharnam specifically to prevent others from entering. But his motivation isn't to keep people safe from the beasts within. Rather, he's protecting the beasts themselves. Jura came to recognize that the beasts trapped in Old Yharnam still retain some vestige of their humanity, that they're victims rather than monsters, and he refuses to participate in further slaughter of them. If you insist on entering Old Yharnam to hunt beasts, Jura will attack you, viewing you as the real threat. His position represents a rejection of the simple narrative that beasts are evil and must be killed, recognizing instead the tragedy of transformation and the humanity lost in the process. The Beast Claw, a weapon you can obtain that transforms your hand into a massive bestial claw, comes with a particularly disturbing revelation in its description. It notes that when you fully embrace the beast within, when you let go of your humanity and embrace your transformation, the hunt becomes easier. You become stronger, faster, more savage. But of course, you also move closer to becoming exactly what you're supposed to be hunting. This represents Bloodborne's fundamental question. In fighting monsters, how do you avoid becoming one yourself? And perhaps more disturbingly, what if becoming a monster is the only way to effectively fight monsters? The School of Mensis's ritual to beckon the blood moon dramatically accelerated the scourge throughout Yharnam. Their attempt to contact Murgo and gain cosmic insight had the side effect of blurring reality with nightmare, of making the blood moon's influence more powerful and pervasive. After you defeat Rom the vacuous spider, after the veil she was maintaining collapses, you find yourself in a transformed Yharnam where the blood moon hangs huge and terrible in the sky, where amygdalae that were previously invisible now cling visibly to buildings, where the nightmare has fully manifested. The scourge becomes even more widespread in this transformed reality, with more and more citizens undergoing transformation. What makes the beast scourge particularly unhinged is its inevitability. It's not something that can be cured or prevented, not permanently. As long as old blood flows through Yharnam's citizens, as long as blood ministration continues, transformations will happen. The hunt can cull individual beasts, but it can't stop the underlying cause. The Healing Church created a situation where their miracle cure inevitably led to a plague that required constant violence to manage. And that violence itself contributed to the problem by making people more susceptible to transformation. It's a perfect trap, a self-perpetuating cycle of blood and violence that benefits only the cosmic entities manipulating events from beyond human perception. The Fishing Hamlet, the original sin. If there's a single event that could be called Bloodborne's original sin, the foundational atrocity from which so much horror flows, it's what happened at the Fishing Hamlet. This small coastal village, accessible only through the Old Hunters DLC by way of the Astral Clock Tower and Lady Maria's Boss Arena, represents the site where Byrgenwerth scholars and their accompanying hunters committed acts so terrible that they cursed themselves and every hunter who would follow. Understanding what happened at the Fishing Hamlet is crucial to understanding the hunter's nightmare, Gehrman's eternal torment, and the deep guilt that permeates certain characters' stories. The Fishing Hamlet was a small, isolated community whose inhabitants worshipped a great one called Kos, or as some say, Cosm. Kos was described as a slug-like, mollusk-resembling sea creature of enormous size, and she seemed to have a genuinely benevolent relationship with the hamlet's inhabitants. Unlike other great ones who remained distant and incomprehensible, Kos apparently helped the fishing village and its people, who in turn revered her as a protective deity. The relationship between Kos and the hamlet seemed almost symbiotic, with the Great One providing blessings and the humans offering devotion. It was perhaps the closest thing to a healthy relationship between humans and Great Ones that existed in Bloodborne's world. At some point, Kos washed up dead on the hamlet's shore. The circumstances of her death remain mysterious. Did she die of natural causes, whatever that might mean for a Great One? Was she killed by something? Did she deliberately come to the hamlet seeking aid or shelter? We don't know. But her massive corpse lay on the beach, and the villagers, already connected to her through their worship, began cultivating the parasites that lived within her body. These Kos parasites possessed strange properties, apparently capable of triggering transformation or transcendence in humans who hosted them. The relationship between the hamlet and Kos deepened through this cultivation, with the villagers developing fish-like qualities and acquiring abilities tied to Kos's nature. Then Byrgenwerth came, Master Willem's scholars, driven by their pursuit of eyes on the inside and eager to understand how humans could commune with great ones and achieve transcendence, discovered the fishing hamlet and immediately recognized its significance. Here was a community that had achieved genuine connection with a great one, whose members showed physical signs of transformation and possibly possessed the cosmic insight that Byrgenwerth sought. If they could understand how this happened, if they could extract the knowledge literally from the villagers' heads, they might unlock the secrets of ascension they'd been seeking. What followed was nothing short of a massacre. The scholars and hunters who accompanied them descended upon the fishing hamlet with brutal efficiency. They killed the villagers systematically. They cracked open skulls, literally looking for eyes on the inside of brains, trying to confirm their theories about cosmic insight being physically manifest. They didn't just kill quickly and efficiently. They tortured, they experimented, they defiled. And worst of all, they desecrated Kos herself, cutting into the dead Great One's corpse, examining it, extracting samples, violating it in pursuit of knowledge. The orphan of Kos was still in Kos's womb when the scholars arrived. Whether the orphan was alive at that point or had already died with its mother remains ambiguous, but the hunter's actions prevented it from being properly born. The orphan, encountered in the Old Hunters DLC as arguably the game's hardest boss, wields its own placenta as a weapon, a grotesque detail that speaks to its nature as something caught between birth and death. The orphan's appearance is disturbing in its humanoid characteristics. It looks more like a human than most Great Ones, suggesting it might have been a hybrid of human and Great One. But its skeletal, emaciated appearance and the rictus permanently fixed on its face express only suffering and rage. Lady Maria participated in this massacre, and the guilt of it destroyed her. Maria had been a skilled hunter, trained by Gehrman, wielding her rakuyo with masterful technique. But after the fishing hamlet, she threw her beloved weapon down a well, symbolic of her rejection of hunting and violence. She took her own life, unable to cope with what she'd done, unable to wash the blood from her hands, metaphorically or perhaps even literally. In death, Maria ended up in the hunter's nightmare, specifically tasked with guarding the approach to the fishing hamlet, preventing anyone from accessing the secrets of that terrible night. When you fight her, she uses blood arts extensively, covering her weapons in blood that seems to come from nowhere, possibly representing the blood that has stained her since that night. Evidence suggests Gehrman was also involved in the fishing hamlet atrocity, though his exact role remains unclear. The orphan's cries use the same audio file as Gehrman's sleeping lamentations. After you defeat the orphan, the doll comments that Gehrman is sleeping more peacefully than he has in a long time. The Old Hunters DLC promotional material showed a figure dressed like Gehrman, with his distinctive peg leg, approaching the lighthouse hut in the fishing hamlet. These connections imply that Gehrman was there during the massacre, possibly playing a significant role, and that the guilt of it has haunted him ever since, perhaps contributing to his decision to make the deal with the moon presence that resulted in the hunter's dream. The curse that fell upon the hunters originated from the fishing hamlet atrocity. The surviving villagers and priests called out to Kos for vengeance against those who had violated their home and murdered their people. Kos, despite being dead in the physical sense, responded. Great Ones apparently retain consciousness even after their bodies die, existing on a higher plane, and Kos heard the prayers of those who had worshipped her. She created the hunter's nightmare as punishment, a horrible dimension where hunters who become blood-drunk are trapped for eternity, forced to relive endless hunts in a twisted version of reality. The hunter's nightmare is a hellish reflection of parts of Yharnam, filled with hostile hunters, monstrous beasts, and the residual horrors of past hunts. It's specifically designed as punishment for hunters, a place where they can never rest, never escape the hunt, trapped in endless violence until they go completely mad. Every hunter who becomes blood-drunk, who gives in too much to the thrill of killing, who crosses the line from necessary violence into sadistic pleasure, eventually ends up in this nightmare. And it all traces back to what happened at the fishing hamlet, to the original sin committed by those scholars and hunters who thought their pursuit of knowledge justified any atrocity. The fishing hamlet itself, as you explore it in the DLC, is a nightmarish version of what the village once was. The inhabitants have become monstrous fish creatures, their heads grotesquely enlarged, but they still retain enough vestige of their humanity to be disturbing. They wield tools and weapons, they work together, they exhibit behavior that suggests they remember being human. One of them, encountered at the very start of the area, continuously prays and curses the hunters, speaking of Kos and the orphan, but he cannot be killed no matter how much you attack him. He simply keeps praying, keeps cursing, an eternal witness to the crime committed against his people. Brador, the church assassin, invades you multiple times as you progress through the fishing hamlet. Brador was imprisoned by the church specifically to prevent him from revealing certain secrets, probably related to the fishing hamlet and the church's involvement in the atrocities there. But in the hunter's nightmare, he's free to hunt you, trying to prevent you from uncovering the full truth of what happened. Killing Brador in his cell before progressing further stops his invasions, but it also means killing a man who was imprisoned specifically for knowing too much, making him perhaps another victim of the church's attempts to hide its crimes. When you finally reach the Orphan of Kos and witness its emergence from its mother's corpse, when you see this creature look up at the dark sun of the nightmare and begin to cry, the emotional weight is overwhelming. This being has been trapped in its mother's dead body, unable to be properly born, suffering in a state between life and death, and its very existence sustains the nightmare that curses all hunters. The orphan's rage, its violence, its attacks on you aren't motivated by evil but by pain, by suffering, by the violation of its mother and itself. It's attacking you because you represent the hunters who did this, who created this nightmare. Defeating the orphan leads to a strange, beautiful moment. A ghostly figure appears above Kos's corpse, and you must strike it to complete the encounter. When you do, the figure dissolves, returning to the ocean, and the sky clears. A narrator speaks. Ah, sweet child of Kos, return to the ocean. A bottomless curse, a bottomless sea, accepting of all that there is and can be. The orphan has been freed, released from its torment, allowed to return to whatever place great ones go when they're truly at peace. And with that release, the curse is lifted. The hunters can finally rest. Gehrman can finally sleep peacefully. The cycle of punishment tied specifically to the fishing hamlet massacre has ended. The fishing hamlet represents everything wrong with Bloodborne's scholars and hunters. They saw something beautiful, a community living in harmony with a great one, and they destroyed it in pursuit of knowledge. They committed atrocities justified by their belief that their goals were more important than the lives of some isolated villagers. They thought they could take what they wanted and suffer no consequences, but the consequences came anyway, in the form of a curse that would haunt hunters for generations. The research hall, accessible through the fishing hamlet and clearly connected to the church's later experiments, suggests that the knowledge gained from the massacre was used to inform further atrocities, creating a through line of horror from that original sin to the church's worst experiments on human subjects. The player's journey, seeking pale blood. Your journey through Bloodborne begins with a simple instruction, delivered during the opening cinematic as you receive a blood transfusion from an old man and begin to hallucinate. Seek pale blood to transcend the hunt. This cryptic directive serves as your only explicit guidance for what you're supposed to accomplish, but understanding what pale blood actually means requires untangling one of the game's most deliberately ambiguous mysteries. Is pale blood a substance? A great one? A location? The answer is yes to all of these, and also more complicated than any single interpretation can capture. The most straightforward interpretation of pale blood is that it refers to the old blood of great ones, the pale, unusual blood that differs from normal human blood. Under this reading, seeking pale blood means understanding the true nature of the blood that flows through Yharnam, discovering its cosmic origins, and comprehending how it connects to the Great Ones. As you progress through the game, you do indeed uncover these truths, learning about the Pthumerians, the Great Ones, and the role that divine blood plays in everything that's happened to Yharnam. Another interpretation suggests that pale blood refers to the moon presence itself. A note found in the lecture building states, "The nameless moon presence beckoned by Lawrence and his associates. Pale blood." Under this reading, your quest to seek pale blood is really a quest to encounter the moon presence, to discover the cosmic entity that lurks behind the hunter's dream and manipulates events in Yharnam. And indeed, the game's true endings all involve confronting or being confronted by the moon presence, suggesting that this interpretation has merit. A third interpretation is that pale blood refers to the sky itself, specifically the pale moon that hangs over Yharnam. The blood moon that appears after you defeat Rom could be considered pale blood in this sense. Transcending the hunt might mean understanding what the moon really is, recognizing it not as a natural celestial body, but as a manifestation of the moon presence or another cosmic force. When the moon appears red and full, when the nightmare fully manifests, you're literally seeing pale blood in the sky. Regardless of which interpretation you prefer, the quest to seek pale blood drives you deeper into Yharnam's mysteries. You start as a foreigner who came to Yharnam seeking blood healing, hoping to cure some unspecified illness through the miracle of blood ministration. But the blood transfusion you receive at the start goes wrong, or perhaps goes exactly as intended. You begin hallucinating, seeing a strange beast in the clinic, and then you find yourself in the hunter's dream, contracted to the hunt whether you consciously chose it or not. Your journey takes you through increasingly disturbing revelations about Yharnam's true nature. Initially, the hunt seems straightforward. Kill beasts to protect people, find Father Gascoigne who's gone missing, reach the healing church to understand what's happening. But as you progress, the horror deepens. You discover that the church isn't what it appears to be. You learn about the Great Ones. You find evidence of experiments, atrocities, and secrets buried beneath layers of lies. The moment when you defeat Rom the vacuous spider marks the game's fundamental turning point. Rom has been maintaining an illusion, keeping the true horror of Yharnam's situation hidden from its inhabitants. When you kill Rom, that illusion shatters. Suddenly, you can see the amygdalae clinging to buildings that were always there but invisible before. The blood moon hangs huge and ominous in the sky. The nightmare that was always present beneath the surface suddenly becomes manifest. This is the moment when Bloodborne transforms from a gothic horror about hunting beasts into full Lovecraftian cosmic horror about incomprehensible entities manipulating reality. Queen Yharnam appears after you defeat Rom, kneeling outside the Grand Cathedral, weeping blood, pointing toward the nightmare of Mensis. She's guiding you, showing you where you need to go next. The School of Mensis's ritual is sustaining the nightmare, and Murgo's crying at its heart is perpetuating the horror. You need to enter the nightmare of Mensis, navigate its horrible landscape, survive the brain of Mensis and the other terrors within, and ultimately reach Murgo's loft where the infant Great One waits. The journey through the nightmare of Mensis is a journey through madness itself. You encounter Mikolash, the host of the nightmare, running through an endless maze, cackling about eyes and insight and cosmic revelations that have driven him completely insane. The architecture itself seems wrong, with impossible geometry and spaces that shouldn't exist. The brain of Mensis hangs in the sky, causing frenzy with its gaze, a physical manifestation of knowledge that breaks minds. Everything about this place speaks to the consequences of seeking truths that humans weren't meant to know. When you finally reach Murgo's wet nurse and defeat her, when you silence Murgo's crying and receive the message, "Nightmare slain," you've accomplished what the moon presence wanted. You've eliminated one of the competing Great One's influences, ended one of the nightmares plaguing Yharnam, done your duty as a hunter. The hunter's dream begins to burn, and Gehrman offers you release. The choice you make at this point determines which of three endings you receive, each representing a different outcome for your character and a different interpretation of what transcending the hunt actually means. The first ending, achieved by accepting Gehrman's offer, seems almost peaceful. He executes you mercifully, and you wake in Yharnam as the sun rises. The night of the hunt is over, at least for you. You'll forget the dream, return to being a normal person, perhaps go back to wherever you came from. You've escaped the nightmare, survived the hunt, and been released. This is the submitting to fate ending. where you accept that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved and some prices aren't worth paying for knowledge. You don't transcend so much as you simply survive. The second ending, achieved by refusing Gehrman's offer and defeating him, but not having consumed 3 umbilical cords, sees you take his place. The moon presence descends, embraces you, and you become the new host of the hunter's dream. You've freed Gehrman, but only by accepting his burden yourself. You'll now guide hunters through their own hunts, trapped in the same prison that held him. This is the becoming complicit ending, where you take on the role of serving the moon presence's agenda, perpetuating the cycle. You transcend your individual hunt, but become a permanent part of the greater hunt's machinery. The third ending, achieved by consuming 3 umbilical cords before defeating Gehrman and then defeating the moon presence, is the strangest and most ambiguous. You transform into an infant Great One, ascending beyond humanity entirely. The doll cradles your new form, and you've become something incomprehensible. This is the achieving transcendence ending, where you've genuinely evolved beyond human limitations. But what have you become? Are you still you in any meaningful sense? Have you achieved enlightenment, or just transformed into another cosmic horror? Is this victory or tragedy or both? The umbilical cords required for the third ending each tell a story. One comes from the abandoned old workshop, representing Gehrman's original deal with the moon presence. One comes from Ariana's infant after she's impregnated by Eden, representing the Great One's yearning for surrogates. One comes from the imposter Iosefka's clinic, representing the church's experiments with creating Great One offspring. And one comes from Murgo's wet nurse, representing the infant Great One whose nightmare you've been fighting through. By consuming these pieces of Great One essence, you're literally incorporating cosmic power into yourself, preparing yourself to resist the moon presence's attempt to enslave you and potentially evolve into something beyond human. The player's journey through Bloodborne is a journey from ignorance to knowledge, but it's also a journey showing how that knowledge comes at terrible prices. You learn the truth about Yharnam, about the Great Ones, about the blood and the hunts and the nightmares. But can you really claim victory when you've become either a servant of cosmic entities or one of them yourself? The game asks whether transcendence is worth the cost of your humanity, whether knowing forbidden truths is better than living in comfortable ignorance, and whether there's any way to break cycles of violence without perpetuating them. Conclusion: a cycle of blood, knowledge, and madness. So here we are, at the end of our journey through Bloodborne's lore. And what have we found? We've uncovered the ruins of an ancient civilization that thought communion with gods would elevate them, only to fall to the same beast plague that would later consume Yharnam. We've seen scholars split over whether eyes or blood offered the path to transcendence, with both approaches leading to transformation and madness. We've witnessed the healing church commit atrocities in pursuit of forcing humanity to ascend, creating nightmares and curses that would persist for generations. We've met the Great Ones, cosmic entities both powerful and pitiable, unable to have children of their own and desperately seeking surrogates among humanity. We've seen how the hunt itself perpetuates the problems it's meant to solve, creating a cycle of violence that feeds on itself. The truly unhinged part of Bloodborne's lore isn't any single revelation, but how everything connects in this massive web of cosmic horror and human tragedy. The Pthumerians fell to the beast scourge because they used old blood. Byrgenwerth discovered the Pthumerian ruins and found that same old blood, leading to the schism that created the healing church. The healing church distributed blood ministration, creating the conditions for the beast scourge to return. The School of Mensis tried to contact Great Ones, beckoning the blood moon that accelerated the scourge. The massacre at the fishing hamlet cursed hunters with the hunter's nightmare. Gehrman's guilt led to his deal with the moon presence, creating the hunter's dream. The moon presence uses the dream to guide hunters to kill competing Great Ones, and the player character arrives seeking pale blood, unknowingly playing a role in cosmic games they can barely comprehend. The theme of motherhood, pregnancy, and children runs through the entire narrative in deeply disturbing ways. Every Great One loses its child and yearns for a surrogate. Queen Yharnam was impregnated by Eden and had her child stolen. Ariana gets impregnated by Eden through corrupted blood. The imposter Iosefka becomes pregnant after the blood moon descends. The moon presence seeks surrogates to replace its lost child, binding first Gehrman and potentially then you to the hunter's dream. Murgo exists in a state of stillbirth, crying endlessly. The orphan of Kos was never properly born, trapped in its mother's corpse. Kos herself was a mother whose child and body were defiled. The research hall patients had their heads enlarged in grotesque parody of pregnancy, trying to birth eyes on the inside. Even Ram might be seen as a failed attempt at birthing a new form of existence. Everything keeps coming back to birth, to the creation of new life, to the tragedy of losing children, to the desperate attempts to find replacements for what's been lost. The pursuit of knowledge drives everything in Bloodborne, but that knowledge consistently leads to ruin. Willem sought eyes on the inside and ended up ancient and transformed, sitting by a lake with parasites growing from his head. Lawrence sought to use the old blood responsibly and became a massive fire beast. Mikolash sought communion with great ones and lost his mind entirely. The scholars at the fishing hamlet sought to understand how humans could transcend and committed atrocities that cursed their entire profession. The choir sought to elevate humanity and created abominations. Every faction, every character who seeks to understand cosmic truths pays a terrible price for that understanding. Knowledge in Bloodborne isn't power, it's corruption, transformation, madness. And yet, the game doesn't necessarily condemn the pursuit of knowledge outright. The tragedy isn't that people sought to understand, but that they were willing to commit any atrocity, to sacrifice any number of lives, to pay any price except their own in that pursuit. The scholars at the fishing hamlet didn't just seek knowledge, they murdered an entire village to get it. The healing church didn't just research the old blood, they experimented on unwilling subjects and may have even deliberately created plague conditions. The School of Mensis didn't just try to contact great ones, they performed rituals that accelerated suffering throughout Yharnam. It's not curiosity that damns these characters, but their willingness to treat other people as expendable resources in service of their goals. The cycle of violence stands as another central theme. The Pthumerians killed and conducted blood rituals. The scholars and hunters massacred the fishing hamlet. The healing church conducted experiments and spread plague. Hunters kill beasts who were once human. Blood-drunk hunters kill indiscriminately. Hunters of hunters kill the blood-drunk. The hunt never ends because violence creates the conditions for more violence. Every attempt to solve problems through killing creates new problems that also seem to require killing. And the cosmic entities manipulating events from beyond human perception apparently want this cycle to continue, using the endless hunt and endless violence for their own inscrutable purposes. Bloodborne asks whether there's any way to break these cycles, whether transcendence is possible without losing your humanity, whether you can gain forbidden knowledge without being destroyed by it. The three endings offer different answers. You can submit to fate, accepting that some mysteries are beyond human comprehension and returning to normal life. You can become complicit, taking on the burden of maintaining the cycle so others can be freed from it. Or you can attempt genuine transcendence, consuming enough cosmic power that you evolve beyond humanity entirely, though what you become might not be you anymore in any meaningful sense. The lore of Bloodborne is utterly unhinged because it takes the standard cosmic horror premise of humans encountering incomprehensible entities and adds layers of human cruelty, tragic mistakes, and disturbing parallels between cosmic entities and humanity. The Great Ones aren't just alien and incomprehensible, they're also weirdly sympathetic, losing their children and yearning for replacements. The scholars and clergy aren't just victims of cosmic manipulation, they're actively making terrible choices that harm innocent people. The player character isn't just a hero fighting monsters, they're potentially just another pawn being used by cosmic entities for purposes they can barely grasp. Everything about this world is wrong. A church that's really a research organization conducting immoral experiments. Blood that heals but also transforms you into a monster. A dream that's really a prison. Hunters who protect people from beasts but become beasts themselves. A city built on the ruins of a fallen civilization that fell for the exact same reasons Yharnam is falling. Great ones that are gods but also pitiable creatures unable to have children. An infant that's been dead or stillborn but also exists and cries and sustains entire nightmare dimensions. a first hunter who's trying to free you by killing you, and cosmic entities that want you to kill other cosmic entities. And somehow, through all of this madness, through all of these layers of horror and tragedy and cosmic manipulation, Bloodborne manages to tell a coherent story. It's a story about the price of ambition, about the dangers of seeking forbidden knowledge, about the cycles of violence that perpetuate themselves, about the thin line between protecting humanity and losing your humanity. It's a story where almost everyone who seeks to ascend or transcend or elevate themselves ends up transformed into something monstrous, or trapped in endless service, or driven completely insane. It's a story where the best ending might be simply surviving and walking away, choosing ignorance over the knowledge that breaks minds. The lore of Bloodborne is mesmerizing precisely because it's so unhinged. Every revelation leads to more questions. Every answer reveals how little we truly understand. Every character we meet is either a victim, a perpetrator, or both. Every location we visit holds secrets of past atrocities. Every great one we encounter is simultaneously powerful and tragic. The game builds this massive, intricate web of connections and then asks you to find meaning in it, to piece together the truth from fragments, to understand something that might be fundamentally incomprehensible. So yes, the lore of Bloodborne is unhinged, but it's also brilliant, tragic, horrifying, and utterly fascinating. It's a masterpiece of cosmic horror that understands that the scariest thing isn't the monsters you fight, but the realization of how many terrible things were done before you ever arrived, how little power you truly have, and how even your greatest victories might just be fulfilling the agenda of incomprehensible cosmic entities that view you as a tool, a vessel, or a surrogate for the children they've lost. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of gaming's most complex and disturbing narratives. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Bloodborne's utterly unhinged lore, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more explorations of RPG game lore and theory. Until next time, may you find your worth in the waking world, and may the good blood guide your way.